Ma'am, this area is for decorated personnel and immediate family only. I'm going to have to ask you to step back. The voice was young, laced with the brittle confidence of someone who had recently been given a sliver of authority and was determined to wield it like a broadsword. The crowd, a somber sea of dressed blues and polished brass, stirred. A few nervous coughs broke the hallowed silence of Arlington National Cemetery. Most, however, simply turned their heads, a ripple of curiosity passing through the rows of mourners. They saw the source of the disruption, a young, overzealous honor guard sergeant, ramrod straight, his face a mask of stern duty, and the woman he was blocking. She was nothing, unremarkable, a ghost in a plain black dress that seemed to absorb the weak afternoon light. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, with not a single strand out of place. She wore no makeup, no jewelry save for a simple, functional watch. She held no purse. Her hands were empty, held loosely at her sides. She was an island of civilian anonymity in an ocean of military tradition, and the sergeant had appointed himself the guardian of that tradition. He saw a tourist, a grief chaser, someone who felt entitled to a front-row seat at the funeral of the great General Marcus Wallace, a man who was a living legend long before he was a dead hero. The sergeant puffed out his chest slightly, his voice rising in volume, ensuring the nearby colonels and majors could hear him upholding the standard. "This is a private, solemn occasion," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's for the warriors who served with him, the family who loved him. It is not a public spectacle for gawkers. Show some respect." The insult, sharp and public, hung in the cold air. A few of the younger officers nearby nodded in grim agreement, their faces reflecting the sergeant's disdain. They saw what he saw, an outsider who didn't belong. But the woman offered no reaction. Her face remained a placid mask, her gaze not fixed on the sergeant who was berating her, but past him, locked onto the flag-draped casket resting on its caisson. There was no flicker of anger, no flush of shame, no hint of defiance. Her breathing remained slow and even, her shoulders perfectly relaxed. It was her stillness that was so unnerving. It wasn't the rigid stillness of fear or the defiant stillness of anger. It was the absolute, practiced calm of a predator or a stone. This profound lack of reaction seemed to infuriate the sergeant more than any argument could have. He had expected tears or a stammered apology or a heated protest. He was prepared for those. He was not prepared for this silence. This absolute, dismissive competence in the face of his authority. He took a half-step closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "Did you hear me? Or are you just going to stand there? Show me your credentials or move along." The woman's eyes finally shifted, moving from the casket to meet his. They were clear and gray, and for a terrifying second, the sergeant felt as if he were being scanned, weighed, and dismissed. A chill he couldn't explain traced a path down his spine. All she said, her voice quiet but clear, devoid of any emotion, was, "Understood," yet she did not move. She simply stood her ground, a silent, unassuming pillar of granite. And across the field, near the front row, a four-star general, who had been observing the quiet drama with a heavy heart, felt a flicker of recognition as he saw her stance. He saw the way her feet were planted exactly shoulder-width apart, the perfect distribution of her weight, the subtle way her head remained level while her eyes took in everything. It was a stance he hadn't seen in years, a ghost stance. He knew then that this funeral was about to become a lesson. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type respect below. The sergeant, emboldened by her seeming compliance, yet frustrated by her immobility, decided to press his advantage. He saw her quiet understood, not as an acknowledgement, but as a prelude to retreat, and he wanted to make sure the lesson was learned by all who watched. He was performing not just for the officers around him, but for the very idea of military order itself. In his mind, she represented chaos, the civilian world's sloppy sentimentality intruding upon the sacred, ordered grief of the warrior class. He was the thin line of discipline holding back that chaos. Understood what? He snapped, his voice a sharp crack in the reverent quiet. Understood that you were disrupting a flag officer's funeral? Understood that you were showing immense disrespect to the memory of a man who gave his entire life to this country? Or did you just understand that you've been caught trying to sneak into a place you don't belong? His words were a volley, each one intended to wound her pride and force her public retreat. He gestured with a white-gloved hand toward the rows of decorated attendees. Look around you, ma'am. These are generals. These are Medal of Honor recipients. These are soldiers who bled with General Wallace in the sands of a dozen countries. Their right to be here is written in scars and citations. What right do you have? He paused, letting his question hang in the air, a public indictment. The woman, Alara Vance, remained a statue. Her focus had shifted back to the casket, her profile as impassive as a carving on a monument. It was this very impassivity that was her shield and her weapon. It created a vacuum into which the sergeant poured all his arrogance, all his assumptions, and all his insecurities. He mistook her professional calm for personal weakness. He saw her silence not as discipline, but as an admission of guilt. He saw her simple dress not as a choice, but as proof of her lowly station. Every conclusion he drew was a perfect inversion of the truth. His prejudice was a mirror, and all he could see was a reflection of his own limited understanding of the world. He failed to notice the small things, the details that would have screamed a warning to a more experienced eye. He didn't see the faint, pale line of a scar that traced her left temple, mostly hidden by her hair. He didn't see the way her knuckles were slightly calloused, the hands of someone intimately familiar with tools or weapons. He didn't register that her cheap, functional watch was a military-grade chronometer, waterproof to 200 meters and built to withstand extreme shock. He did not, above all, comprehend the nature of the world in which General Wallace had operated, a world of shadows and whispers, where the most dangerous people were the ones no one ever saw coming. He only saw a woman who was out of place, a nail that needed to be hammered down. And so, he continued his hammering. I'm not going to ask you again. Step behind the public barrier. Now, he made a move to place a hand on her arm, to escort her away physically, a final assertion of his control over the space. It was a critical, profound mistake. He was about to touch the untouchable, to lay a hand on the silent shield that had guarded a 4-star general for a decade in the most dangerous places on Earth. The moment the sergeant's fingers brushed her sleeve, a change occurred. It was not a visible, dramatic transformation, but a subtle, seismic shift in the energy around her. Her eyes, which had been fixed on the distant casket, snapped back to his. The placid gray irises seemed to harden, to become chips of polished steel. The air temperature around them felt as if it dropped 10 degrees. The sergeant's hand froze, then recoiled as if he had touched a live wire. He hadn't been threatened, not with a word or a gesture, but he felt a sudden, primal wave of danger wash over him. It was the instinct of a prey animal that has just realized the shadow passing over it belongs to a hawk. In that split second, his entire perception of the situation was scrambled. The woman before him was no longer a lost tourist. She was something else, something ancient and lethal that he had been foolish enough to provoke. He saw, for the first time, the utter absence of fear in her eyes. It was an absence so complete that it was, in itself, terrifying. Before he could process this new, horrifying data, the world intervened. A sudden, violent gust of wind, a freak squall, tore across the hallowed green of Arlington. It howled through the ancient oaks and whipped at the crisp dress uniforms of the attendees. It was a physical manifestation of the tension that had been building, a sudden burst of meteorological fury. The ceremonial flag, the magnificent stars and stripes that lay draped over General Wallace's casket, was caught by the gale. The heavy, embroidered fabric billowed up like a sail. The two young soldiers of the honor guard, caught by surprise, struggled to hold it down. For a half-second, they held on, their faces masks of straining effort. But the wind was too strong. With a sound like tearing silk, the flag was ripped from their grasp. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. The symbol of a nation, the sacred shroud for a fallen warrior, was airborne. Her body, which had been a study in stillness, became a blur of controlled, fluid motion. She moved with a terrifying grace, her simple black dress swirling around her as she closed the distance. Her arm extended, not in a desperate grab, but with the calm certainty of a master craftsman reaching for a familiar tool. Her hand met the falling flag not with a slap, but with a gentle, receiving cup of her palm. Her fingers curled around the heavy fabric just inches from the grass. She didn't just catch it. She gathered it, her other hand coming up to support its weight, her arms moving in a practiced, reverent motion. She folded a corner over her forearm, securing the flag against her body, shielding it from the wind and the ground. She had saved it. In the space of 2 heartbeats, the woman who had been publicly accused of disrespect had single-handedly prevented the ceremony's ultimate disgrace. The aftermath was a silence more profound and complete than any that had come before. The wind died down as suddenly as it had risen, leaving a deafening stillness in its wake. Every eye, from the lowest private to the highest-ranking general, was fixed on the solitary figure in the black dress. She stood there, motionless once more, the great American flag held securely in her arms, its vibrant red and white a stark contrast against the somber black of her attire. The heavy fabric was gathered to her chest, as if she were cradling a child, her expression utterly unchanged. She had not performed the act for applause or for recognition. She had done it because it was necessary. It was a problem to be solved, a duty to be performed, and she had performed it with an efficiency that was breathtaking. The 2 honor guard soldiers stood frozen, their hands still outstretched, their faces a mixture of shame and utter disbelief. The young sergeant who had been her accuser was a statue of shock, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension. The entire narrative he had constructed in his mind, of the disrespectful outsider, of his own role as the stern guardian of tradition, had been utterly demolished in a single, fluid act. The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. He had lectured her on respect, and she had just given a masterclass in it. He had questioned her right to be there, and she had just proven she was more essential than anyone. The crowd of decorated soldiers and grieving family members remained utterly still, a tableau of stunned awe. They were professionals, men and women who understood excellence when they saw it. And what they had just witnessed was a form of excellence, so pure, so instinctual, that it defied easy categorization. It wasn't just athleticism. It was a physical manifestation of a deeper principle. It was the economy of motion that comes only from thousands of hours of training. It was the calm under pressure that can't be taught, only forged in crucibles of unimaginable stress. It was, in a word, competence. A quiet, absolute competence that had just announced itself more loudly than any shouted boast or displayed medal ever could. The sergeant finally found his voice, but it was just a choked whisper, a single word of disbelief that carried in the unnatural quiet. How? It wasn't a question directed at her, but at the universe, at the shattering of his own certainty. How could this unassuming woman move like that? How could she possess reflexes that surpassed those of the highly trained honor guard? How could she, in one motion, embody the very ideals he had accused her of defiling? The answer was coming. It was striding toward them from the front row, its shoulders adorned with the 4 silver stars that signified one of the most powerful military officers on the planet. General Thompson, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was a man whose face was famously hard to read, a mask of strategic calm. But now, as he approached Alara, there was something in his eyes that no one had seen in years, a look of profound, undisguised, and reverent respect. He did not look at the sergeant. He did not look at the crowd. His entire focus was on the silent woman holding the flag. General Thompson moved with a purpose that parted the sea of mourners. Colonels and majors snapped to attention as he passed, their own shock momentarily forgotten in the presence of their supreme commander. But Thompson barely register their salutes. His gaze was locked on Alara Vance, and in his mind, a flood of memories was unleashed. He saw this same woman, younger but with the same unnerving calm, standing in the shadows of a dusty command tent in Kandahar while rockets fell outside. He saw her materializing out of a Baghdad alleyway to neutralize a threat to General Wallace's convoy before Wallace himself even knew he was in danger. He remembered Wallace's own words, spoken late one night over a secure channel. "Thompson, they gave me a guardian angel. Only she doesn't have wings. She carries a suppressed pistol and the eyes of a wolf. They call her the Ghost." Thompson had never met her formally. Her entire existence was a classified secret, a name buried under layers of black ink and need-to-know protocols. But he knew of her legend. And now, here she was, in the flesh, revealed by a gust of wind and the arrogant ignorance of a young sergeant. He came to a halt directly in front of her. The young sergeant, seeing the four-star general, turned bone-white and snapped into the most rigid salute of his life, his body trembling slightly. Thompson ignored him completely, his focus solely on Alara. For a long moment, the two of them stood in silence, the highest-ranking officer in the military and the anonymous woman in black, a universe of unspoken understanding passing between them. He looked at the flag she held, then at her face. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, meant only for her, but in the pin-drop silence it carried. "We were worried you wouldn't make it. Ghost," the call sign landed in the air like a physical object. The word ghost echoed in the minds of the senior officers nearby, men who had heard whispers of a legendary, almost mythical operative attached to Wallace. The whispers were true. The myth was real, and she was standing right here. Thompson then turned his head slightly, his eyes finally falling upon the petrified sergeant. His voice was no longer quiet. It became a resonant baritone, infused with the ice-cold authority of command that could move fleets and armies. "Sergeant," the sergeant flinched. "Sir," he croaked. "You will stand down," Thompson commanded. He then turned to the commander of the honor guard detail, a young captain whose face was a portrait of mortification. "Captain, have your men retake their positions. Ms. Vance will do you the honor of returning the flag." He deliberately used her name, giving her an identity, a reality, pulling her out of the anonymous shadows. Then, he did something that sent a shockwave through the entire assembly. General James Thompson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a man who received salutes but rarely initiated them to those of lower station, slowly and deliberately raised his right hand to his brow. He executed a perfect, textbook salute, not to the flag she held, but to the woman herself. It was a gesture of respect so profound, so far beyond the bounds of normal protocol, that it was like a coronation. He was publicly declaring her his equal, if not his superior, in a domain that everyone present understood, the domain of honor. With the salute still held, General Thompson finally addressed the stunned crowd, his voice carrying to the furthest ranks. He was not just correcting a subordinate. He was recalibrating the reality of everyone present. He was teaching a lesson that would be etched into the memory of all who heard it. "For those of you who are confused," he began, his gaze sweeping over the assembled officers, "allow me to clarify what you have just witnessed." He lowered his salute and turned his body slightly, positioning himself between Alara and the shamed sergeant, a human shield of validation. "This sergeant," he said, his voice hard as granite, was operating under a set of assumptions. He saw a woman in civilian clothes and assumed she was an outsider. He saw a lack of medals and assumed a lack of service. He saw silence and assumed weakness. "These assumptions, Sergeant," he said, his eyes boring into the young man, "are the sign of an amateur, and they have caused you to publicly disrespect one of the most distinguished soldiers to ever serve this nation." A murmur went through the crowd. "Soldier? Her?" Thompson raised a hand, calling for silence. "You will not find her records in any public database. You will not see her face in unit photographs. Her name is Alara Vance. For 10 years, she was the single operative protective detail for General Marcus Wallace. Her Official unit designation was Special Operations Detachment Ghost. A unit with a roster of 1 inch, he let that sink in. A unit of 1. The implication was staggering. It spoke of a level of skill and trustworthiness that was almost beyond comprehension. Her mission, Thompson continued, his voice ringing with authority, was to be the invisible shield, to stand between General Wallace and any threat at any time in any place. She did so in Fallujah, in the Karangal Valley, in Mogadishu, and in a dozen other places whose names will remain classified. While the rest of us wore our rank on our collars, she wore hers in her competence, in her silence, in her absolute professionalism. He took a step closer to the sergeant, whose face had crumpled in on itself with the weight of his colossal error. You asked her to show you credentials. Let me provide them for you. Her qualifications include the Distinguished Service Cross, awarded for derailing a multi-pronged assassination attempt in Kabul, an action for which she sustained injuries that would have killed a lesser person. She holds a Silver Star with 3 oak leaf clusters, a Bronze Star for valor, a Purple Heart, all of which she was awarded in classified ceremonies and is forbidden from wearing on any uniform. Her official combat record lists over 2,000 hours outside the wire. Her sidearm qualification score is legendary at Fort Bragg. Her legacy is not written on a uniform, Sergeant. It's written in the fact that General Wallace died in his bed of old age, surrounded by his family, and not in a burning vehicle or a compromised safe house a decade ago. Each credential was a hammer blow, shattering the sergeant's arrogant certainty into a million pieces. Thompson then turned back to Alara. She calmly, and with perfect ceremony, folded the flag she held into a tight, respectful triangle and presented it to him. He accepted it with a solemn nod. General Wallace's last official act, Thompson said, his voice softening slightly, was to sign a commendation. In it, he called Miss Vance the finest soldier I've ever known. He requested that, should she be present, she be considered his family. Because in his eyes, he looked directly at the sergeant one last time. You did not block a tourist today. You blocked his daughter. The story of that moment at Arlington became a modern military legend almost before the final volley of the rifle salute had faded. It spread not through official channels, but through the faster, more potent network of military gossip. It was texted from a colonel at the funeral to a subordinate at the Pentagon. It was shared over a crackling line to a forward operating base in Afghanistan. It was whispered in the barracks at Fort Benning and recounted with awe in the ready rooms of aircraft carriers in the Pacific. The details were honed and polished with each telling, but the core elements remained immutable. The arrogant guard, the silent woman, the falling flag, and the 4-star general's stunning salute. The incident was given a name. The ghost's vindication, the image of Alara Vance, the unassuming quiet professional, became a new archetype for a generation of service members. She represented the ideal that true worth wasn't measured in the gleam of polished metals or the volume of one's voice, but in the silent, flawless execution of one's duty. The young sergeant who had been the catalyst for the entire event was not formally punished in a way that would mar his career. General Thompson was too wise for that. A public reprimand would teach fear. He wanted to teach wisdom. The sergeant was personally counseled by his battalion's command sergeant major, a man with 3 decades of service and a face like a roadmap of every conflict since Desert Storm. The old soldier didn't yell. He simply sat the young man down in his office, over 2 cups of thick, black coffee, and spoke to him about the nature of the shadow world. He explained that the most dangerous men and women he had ever known were the ones who could walk through a room completely unnoticed. He told him that assumptions were a luxury no soldier could afford, in combat or on ceremonial duty. Your job, the old warrior said, his voice a low rumble, is to see what's really there, not what you expect to see. You looked at that woman and saw a civilian. You failed to see a soldier. The general didn't have to correct you. She did. When she caught that flag, she told you everything you needed to know about who she was. You just weren't listening with your eyes. That conversation changed the sergeant's life. The brittle shell of his arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding humility. He understood, in a way that no regulation book could ever teach him, the profound difference between authority and respect. He had learned that true strength was quiet, and that the highest honor was often invisible. Alara Vance, for her part, did not linger to receive the apologies or the accolades. As soon as the ceremony concluded and she had quietly accepted the folded flag from General Thompson on behalf of the Wallace family, she simply vanished. She faded back into the anonymity from which she had emerged, leaving behind a changed landscape. She had not sought the spotlight. It had found her, and she wanted no part of it. Her duty to General Wallace was complete. Her final act of service was not catching the flag, but attending his funeral, a silent, final watch over the man she had protected for so long. The ripple effects of her actions, however, continued to spread. The legend of the ghost at Arlington became an informal training tool. Drill instructors at Parris Island and Fort Jackson would tell the story to new recruits, using it as a parable about the importance of humility and the dangers of judging by appearances. It was a perfect lesson in the core values of the service, that honor is about action, not appearance, that courage is often silent, and that respect must be earned by all and given to all. The young sergeant, whose name was soon forgotten by the legend weavers, became a better NCO. He was observed to be more thoughtful, more observant, and far more respectful to the civilians who visited the cemetery. He was once overheard gently guiding a lost-looking elderly couple, speaking to them with a kindness and patience that his younger self would have disdained. He was teaching the new honor guards under his command not just the mechanics of their duty, but its spirit. Look for the stillness, he would tell them. The ones who are truly dangerous, the ones who truly belong, they don't make a sound. They're just there. Watch for them and show them the respect they've earned. Even if you can't see the proof of it, a symbolic artifact of the day was quietly created. In the command center of the Arlington Honor Guard, someone pinned a small, blurry photograph taken by one of the attendees. It showed a woman in a simple black dress, the American flag held against her chest, and a 4-star general saluting her. Underneath, someone had typed a simple label. The Ghost Protocol. Assume competence. It was a constant, silent reminder. A reminder that the most important legacies are often carried by the quietest people, and that true professionalism needs no introduction. It is its own credential. It is its own proof. It is its own authority. Months later, the chill of winter had given way to the tentative warmth of a Virginia spring. The trees of Arlington were budding, a cycle of renewal playing out over the fields of eternal rest. The young sergeant, his face now carrying a maturity that belied his years, stood his post near the tomb of the unknown soldier. The crowds were thick with tourists and school groups, a river of civilian life flowing through the military's most sacred ground. He observed them not with his old cynicism, but with a new, educated eye. He watched their hands, their posture, the way they carried themselves. He was no longer looking for threats, but for stories, for the hidden signs of service that he had once been blind to. A man with a subtle limp, a woman with a faded unit tattoo barely visible on her wrist. He saw them now. He saw them all. A small family, a mother and 2 young children, appeared lost. The mother was frantically consulting a map, her frustration mounting. The old sergeant would have ignored them, seeing them as a nuisance. The new sergeant approached. "Ma'am, can I help you find something?" he asked, his voice calm and respectful. The woman looked up, relieved. "Yes, thank you. My husband, he served with General Wallace. We wanted to pay our respects, but I can't seem to find his resting place." The sergeant's posture straightened slightly. "It would be my honor to escort you," he said. He led the family through the winding paths, answering the children's questions with a gentle patience. When they arrived at the general's grave, marked by a simple, elegant headstone, he stood a respectful distance away while the family had their private moment. He was no longer just a guard. He was a custodian of memory, a facilitator of respect. He had finally learned his lesson. The story of Alara Vance had become institutional folklore. It was told to cadets at West Point to illustrate the concept of the quiet professional, It was used in intelligence schools as a case study in how legends are born and how critical information can be gleaned from nonverbal cues. The Ghost Protocol had become an unofficial but widely understood principle among security details for high-ranking officials worldwide. Never underestimate the person in the plain dress. Never mistake silence for weakness. Always assume competence until proven otherwise. Alara Vance had, without intending to, change the culture. She had provided a new story, a new hero, one who embodied the service's most profound ideals without ever wearing its uniform publicly. Her single act of fluid, reflexive competence did more to teach the meaning of respect than 1,000 lectures or 100 regulation books ever could. She had proven that the content of one's character, the depth of one's skill, and the strength of one's honor were the only uniform that truly mattered. The legacy of that windy afternoon was not carved in stone or memorialized on a plaque. It was something far more powerful and enduring. It became a living principle, woven into the operational DNA of the institution General Wallace had served. The story became a teaching tool, a moral compass for new generations. It was a reminder that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most important, and that true authority is not granted by rank, but commanded by capability. Alara Vance sought no monument, but she became one. She became a symbol of the quiet, unseen professional, the silent shield upon which the safety of others is built. Her actions serve as a powerful testament to the idea that some warriors fight their battles in the shadows, their victories never known, their sacrifices never celebrated. Their only reward is the quiet satisfaction of a duty perfectly performed, a promise silently kept. This is the nature of true honor. It is not a thing to be displayed for public admiration, but a private code, an internal standard of excellence upheld when no one is watching. It is the steady hand in a crisis, the calm voice in the storm, the unseen protector who asks for nothing in return. It is a legacy not of what is said, but of what is done. The sergeant who learned his lesson that day went on to have a long and honorable career, forever marked by the humility he gained. He would often look at the new soldiers under his command, searching their faces for that same arrogant certainty he once possessed, and he would take it upon himself to temper it with the story of the ghost. He ensured that the lesson he learned at great personal cost would be passed on, protecting others from making the same mistake. He taught them that respect is a currency to be spent wisely, and that the most deserving are often the last to demand it. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in a tangible form. It is the standard that continues forward in your absence. General Wallace's legacy was not just his record of military victories, but the unwavering loyalty and professionalism of the silent guardian who stood by his side. And Alara Vance's legacy was the quiet, profound truth she demonstrated to all, that assumptions are the enemy of wisdom, and that the deepest respect is always commanded by competence. For more stories where quiet strength triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.